Welcome, everyone, to our Annie's Conversation, the first 93 days, and its impact on agriculture, a Washington update. We're thrilled to be offering this program in conjunction with Farm Credit. Farm Credit is a legacy sponsor of Annie's project, and we really appreciate their support. And this is the first time that we have done one of these programs, so we're particularly thrilled to kick it off with Jenny, and you'll hear more about her in just a moment. Annie's Project is a national nonprofit. Our mission is to empower women in agriculture to be successful through education, networks, and resources. I'm Doris Mold, and I am the co-CEO of Annie's Project. And with me today is our other co-CEO, Carisha Devlin, who will introduce herself and our speaker for today.
Thank you, Doris. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Jenny Mesirow is the Executive Vice President of Government Affairs with Farm Credit Council, and she represents the Farm Credit Council before Congress and administration and advocates for policies vital to rural communities and agriculture. And during her almost 20 years in Washington, she's developed deep bipartisan relationships across Capitol Hill with stakeholders in both the agriculture and rural advocacy space. She enjoys traveling across the country to present at conferences and the Farm Credit System meetings with key stakeholder groups about the work the Farm Credit Council is doing to advance farm credit's legislative priorities and reputation. Before joining the council, she served as legislative director to Congressman Travis Childers of Mississippi, managing his legislative team and his responsibilities on the House Agriculture Committee, as well as his work in healthcare, legislative, foreign affairs, and defense. Mesirow started in politics in 2006 as a Space Coast political director on the gubernatorial campaign for Senator Rod Smith of Florida before joining the congressional office of Congressman Tim Mahoney of Florida. She grew up in South Florida and earned a master's and bachelor's degree in political science, and she resides in Washington, D.C. with her husband and two children. So as you can hear, Jenny has a wealth of experience in politics. And thank you so much, Jeannie, for sharing your time, energy, and knowledge with us today.
Thank you, Carisha. Thank you, Doris. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be with this group, with all of you this afternoon. I will say one of my first experiences with a farm credit partnership was with Annie's Project. And I know we're very proud of our legacy partnership with this organization and delighted to have a conversation with you about what's going on here in Washington. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. There we go. I hope you're all seeing the true presentation mode. But what I thought I would cover with y'all this afternoon is talk to you a little bit about first what farm credit is, just as a quick reminder. Talk about the administration and what is happening with some of the things I know you're very interested in based on your questions. And then a little bit about Congress and what Congress is hoping to accomplish over the next year to 18 months. And then close out with a little bit of additional information about farm credit and the partnerships that we're trying to drive in this new Congress. So from there, we can jump into farm credit. So for over 100 years, farm credit has supported rural communities and agriculture with reliable, consistent credit and financial services. Our goal is, and our mission is to be a partner for all types of agriculture, however we find it, and to stick with those partnerships today and tomorrow. I personally am with the Farm Credit Council, and Carisha gave me such a fantastic introduction, but I thought I'd tell you a little bit about how the Farm Credit Council fits into the farm credit system. So the council is the national trade association for the entirety of the farm credit system. We're based here in Washington, and we represent farm credit's interests, but also the interests of our customers. So all types of agriculture before Congress, the executive branch, regulators, and we also drive partnerships between friends in the agriculture community like Farm Bureau and Annie's Project. Farm Credit currently has 59 lending institutions that all have geographical service territories across all 50 states and Puerto Rico. And it is my job to make sure that all 59 of these lending institutions and their almost 600,000 customers, their voices are really heard, and that Congress in particular, but also the executive branch, are educated about what farm credit does and our important relationship with rural communities and agriculture. From there, one other point I wanted to make for you is that as a cooperative owned by our borrower customers, we are a very important part of the ag economy, and we're very proud of that. And we like to help people understand that in the banking world, in the finance world, the lending world, we are the only banker that is owned by the farmers that we serve. Moving into Congress and the administration. I know the past 100 years for some of us has felt like 100 days, but I'm hoping during this conversation and through the Q&A process, we can unpack a little bit of what's going on. And if I can't directly answer your questions, hopefully I can make you feel a little bit more comfortable or at ease that, you know, there are folks paying attention and communicating on some of the things that agriculture is obviously very concerned about. So first up, obviously the Republicans now control the presidency and both sides of the Capitol. So they have a very slim majority in the House and a slightly more comfortable cushion, but not a veto-proof cushion over in the Senate. I know you all are so tired of hearing the word Doge. In Washington, it is part of our everyday experience right now. There's a lot of activity continuing to go on. I know after the shareholder meeting yesterday, Mr. Elon Musk has indicated that he will be stepping away from the process, but I would not expect that to change the pace currently at which Doge is trying to find efficiencies within the federal space. A ton of executive actions, tariffs and trade tensions are at their all-time high. And in the midst of all of this, agriculture really still needs to get a farm bill done. So let's talk about the players that are driving these conversations. So you have obviously the president and the vice president. Brooke Rollins, who is the new Secretary of Agriculture at USDA. She has a farm background as a kid, was participated in FFA, but hasn't really worked in agriculture for much of her professional career. You've got Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Typically, the Secretary of the Health and Human Services Agency is not somebody that agriculture is particularly connected with, but with some of the policy ideas that he is driving and that the administration is supporting, it is, I think, more imperative than ever that agriculture and farm credit, as we all figure out ways to communicate with that agency and help them understand some of the things that they may not know about how food is grown and how food is processed. Obviously, we've already talked about Mr. Musk and his effort to slim down the federal government, find that waste, fraud, and abuse. Speaker Johnson, who, if you were paying attention to Congress, last Congress, he was sort of the last man standing in the speaker race and has the probably unenviable job of trying to corral the House of Representatives, which continues to be a little bit unruly. We've got a new Republican leader on the Senate side, Mr. John Thune. He's deeply connected to agriculture, has a deep understanding of the industry, obviously comes from a big ag state in South Dakota. He is, I would describe as a very steady hand. He's a good consensus builder within the Senate, and I would say very respected on both sides of the aisle. Chuck Schumer, who's the minority leader of the Senate, has been around the Senate forever, really understands the rules of the Senate, the specificity of how the Senate operates, which from a parliamentarian perspective, when you're trying to manage bills and do things with a little bit of political gumption, he's a real, he can be a real player in that space and help drive his caucus in certain directions. So he will be a very important voice. And then Hakeem Jeffries, who is the minority leader over in the House side. He's newer to his role as well. So you've got several newbies within the leadership of the House and Senate, but not as new as Speaker Johnson or Majority Leader Thune. So I would say the biggest challenge for Mr. Thune and Speaker Johnson is really to keep their own conference together. So making sure all the Republicans are speaking from the same song sheet and are able to move the president's agenda that he has promised. And then from a Democratic perspective, as I'm sure you've read, Schumer and Jeffries are trying to figure out what their song sheet is. What should the Democrats be coalescing around? What should they be communicating on that's going to connect with the American people to kind of move them out of what a lot of folks are calling the political wilderness? So on to some more specific information about the presidency. President Trump has issued more executive orders in his first 100 days than any modern president. In addition, he's already taken more executive actions than, I believe, Biden, Clinton, H.W., and George W. Bush, as well as Obama. So trying to do a lot with his executive power. And you're seeing some of that run into some pushback on within the court system, obviously pushback from the Democrats, but it's yet to be seen how much the courts are going to really give him as far as, so sorry, they are cleaning the windows outside of my office building. There's a man out the window. Apologize for that. So getting back on track here, they're really kind of throwing everything at the wall, all the spaghetti in all of the issue areas to see what sticks and what they can get the courts to give them some flexibility on versus what they may not. And several of these things, whether it's funding freezes, things at, how the RIFs that you've seen, so the reduction in force at agencies, the elimination of certain programs, that is certainly more starting to trickle down to actual constituents. And we are hearing more that those constituents are calling their members of Congress to say, wait a minute, this may have an unintended or intended, but potentially unintended consequence, particularly in rural America. So we're watching all of that very closely and working with our customers to help them communicate to their members of Congress, who then can communicate to the White House, hey, this is something that is concerning us, or we were waiting on some of this grant funding. We've already spent, from a producer's perspective, we've already spent the money, and how do we kind of unlock some of that understanding at USDA and the rest of the administration? Which brings me to USDA. So potentially a fairly large reorganization project going on over at USDA. They're building out their team, which means that, from a crop insurance perspective, from an implementation perspective of making sure that some of those disaster dollars that Congress passed at the end of the year that I am sure many of you are counting on, as well as some of that economic assistance for agriculture that Congress passed at the end of last year, which I'm sure also many of you are waiting on or have applied for. Having these folks in place makes it easier to process those funds, get them out the door, and get them into the producers' hands who really need them to plan for this year's business. They are continuing to, I think now more with a scalpel, assess their staffing levels and decide what makes the most sense for the agency, and is there staff that can be eliminated. There were many staff who did take the buyout. I think a majority of those folks continue to be folks that are very close to retirement anyway, and maybe just had already passed their retirement eligibility or are a year or two away and are, choosing to end their careers at this point. Others are pushing back and suing the federal government, saying we won't be, whether we're on our probationary period or we've been offered this buyout, we're not interested. We're gonna fight to stay in our federal jobs. There's also been a lot of conversation about consolidation of buildings, consolidation of offices, and I know that that's all concerning to some folks, particularly those of you who are out in the countryside and depend so much on your Farm Service Agency office or your NRCS office. And, it feels to many of us in agriculture that those offices are already understaffed and overwhelmed. So agriculture is in the process of communicating with the administration and helping them understand these folks are so vital in delivering the programs that American agriculture depends upon and American rural communities. So figuring out what's the sweet spot there of being able to continue to deliver those programs effectively, and then finding places to be able to reduce or to find some savings within the federal budget. And that brings me to Congress. So we're 3 months into this Congress, and there's so much to do. Some of these things are a must do. Some of these things are, we would really, really like to do them because they were campaign promises by the president. So immigration and border security, I would put in that category. Is there's no congressional deadline that says something must be done. There's nothing that must be renewed. But it is a huge priority of the administration and the congressional leadership. At the very least, the tax reforms that were put in place in 2017 under the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, that's going to need to be dealt with. It will expire in September, and they will have to do something for those taxes to not revert back to pre-2017 levels. We have to deal with the debt ceiling. So if we do not congressionally raise the amount of money that the United States can carry in debt, then we will not be able to pay our, the folks that have purchased our bonds. So we very much need to deal with that issue. I think the Farm Bill is a must do. If it does not get done by the end of the year, then particularly some of those orphan programs, but a lot of programs in the Farm Bill would cease and revert back to 1949 law, which would be devastating in a lot of industries. NDAA is the National Defense Authorization Act. That has to be done every year. It would have huge implications for our ability to defend ourselves. And then energy and, whether they utilize the reconciliation process, which I'll talk about in a minute, or if they do energy legislation, those are all, I think, from the administration's perspective and Congress's perspective, a nice to have, but they certainly do not have to use the reconciliation process to get things done. So let me take a step back and go like 10,000 feet and talk a little bit about not just what is going on, but why is it so hard to get something done? Why was the last Congress the least productive Congress in history with, really only 40 pieces of legislation signed into law? I would posit that it's because Congress has gotten more and not only more closely divided in the numbers, but the edges of both parties have gotten more polarized. So it is a worse problem in the House than it is in the Senate because the Senate is entire states. But you do see this trend that red states are getting redder and blue states to some extent are getting bluer, which entrenches those senators in their more conservative or more progressive positions. The same in the House, as we have created congressional districts that are less and less purple. So there's only about 23 congressional districts left in the entire country of 435 that every 2 years are truly competitive, no matter what the cycle looks like, no matter what the outside forces are. So that's to say about 50% of the voters in that district tend to vote Republican and about 50% tend to vote Democrats, and there's always crossovers depending on the candidate. So 23 seats, so 23 folks in the House of Representatives that are truly incentivized to find that sweet spot in the middle, to come to the table, to compromise, to work with those members across the aisle to get something done. That's not enough folks out of 435 to drive consensus. So instead, what you have is a bigger group of members on the very conservative Republican end that are more concerned about getting primary to their right and losing their seat, and a bigger contingency of folks on the very progressive end of the Democratic Party who are more concerned about getting primaried to their left, so from a more progressive candidate, and losing their seats than they are about finding that consensus. Now, I know that sounds pretty dire, and unhopeful. But what I will tell you is, despite what you hear coming on the news, despite the situation that I just talked to you about, which is very complicated, there is a lot of cross the aisle cooperation on smaller issues that are still very important to individual states and individual districts. So you will find a lot of kind of strange bedfellows across Congress on legislation because they're able to dial into a really specific issue that they can come together on and work together on that issue. The problem is, with the tight margins, it's so difficult to get things now through the committee process and to the House or the Senate floor that you're not seeing as many of those compromise pieces of legislation moving, because they're trying to reserve the time for the bigger, more controversial items, particularly those that, again, were promised during the campaign. So you're just going to continue, I think, to see, at least over the next year, this battling out of just trying to hammer through in a partisan way everything the House can get to the Senate and everything the Senate can pass to then get to the president, in a partisan vote line. Let me check the chat here.
Jenny, there's nothing
Okay.
general. There's a specific question that I think we'll take later.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, so that brings me to budget reconciliation, which is sort of this convoluted process that was dreamed up by Congress that says whenever you have a Senate, a House, and a presidency all controlled by the same party, you can use a vehicle or a piece of legislation called budget reconciliation to get something done, particularly through the Senate, without having the 60 votes that are required to prevent a filibuster. So you can do it with just 51 votes. And that's really important because in this particular Congress, the Senate only has 52 Republicans. So on any given piece of legislation, to overcome that filibuster threat, which basically kills a piece of legislation, you would need to bring along 8 Democrats to vote on your side. And if they don't want to change the legislation to have to compromise in ways that would attract those 8 Democrats, then they're going to try to put it in reconciliation. And reconciliation, the one requirement is that anything that makes it into that bill, that legislation, has to have a budgetary implication, which means it has to cost money or it has to reduce spending in the federal government. Ripe for that process, obviously, is taxes. So they're going to utilize, or at least try to utilize, the Tax Cuts and the budget reconciliation process to try to get the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act passed. But because this vehicle is moving across Congress, they are also going to try to do a lot of other things, like raise money from the federal government. So they are asking the various committees across the House and Senate to find cuts to programs. They have asked the House Agriculture Committee to find 230 billion cuts. The Senate Ag Committee must find 1 billion cuts. That's not cumulative. That is a separate process. So basically the Senate said, there's no way we're going to find 230. And the House is saying you have to find 230. So at some point, they're going to have to find a level of cuts between 1 billion and 230 billion. And they'll have to figure that out amongst the House and Senate Ag committees once they get to that part of the process. But $230 billion, for context, in the ag space is a significant amount of money. That's a significant amount of money in most likely nutrition funding. But if you think about it in this way, last Congress, they struggled to come up with $50 billion to pass the Farm Bill. So if the Farm Bill changes they were looking to make, for instance, in additional specialty crop programs, in the raising of reference prices in Title I programs, some of the other increases in conservation, et cetera, that they were hoping to do, if they couldn't find $50 billion to pay for those things, now to get a Farm Bill done, they would have to find that $50 billion to pay for the Farm Bill, but then also find another $230 billion in cuts. So now you have to find $280 billion. And that's really painful for agriculture. So we'll see how far they get in that process and whether we're really talking closer to 230 billion or closer to 1 billion. But they're trying to come up with as much money as possible to pay for the between $4 and $5 trillion that extending or making permanent the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act would cost. And then they're also trying to put in there border funding and Department of Defense funding and funding for opening up new sources of energy, all in that same bill. So a lot of very controversial things, all in the same piece of legislation that now those four folks that we talked about at the beginning, the House and Senate leadership has to try to navigate. There are, in addition to the Farm Bill, which we'll talk about in a second, in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, there are some really important provisions that were included in the 2017 bill that agriculture is hoping will continue to be included in the conversation. Oops. So included in that was a reduction in the estate tax. So what's at stake is that there would be hopefully an estate tax, at least current policy extension for agriculture. 199A qualified business income deduction is in there, section 179 expensing, bonus depreciation, and 1031 like-kind exchanges. These are all tools, some of which are very important to farm credit, but many of which are very important to how our customers manage their tax liability. And I assume how many of you manage your tax liability as well. So these are all things that if they are not able to achieve at the very least some sort of extension of the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, then these tax burdens would revert back to pre-2017 and would hit American agriculture operations in a pretty significant way. So there's real things at stake in this tax/reconciliation conversation for agriculture. In addition to all of this, basically every American would see some sort of tax implications if they are not able to pass something. And 22% of Americans would experience a fairly significant tax hike if they are not able to achieve something by September 30th. So the stakes here are really, really high. And I think right now the Republicans through the reconciliation process are utilizing a go it alone strategy. But I will tell you, there's very few Democrats and no Republicans who feel as though it is appropriate in this economy currently to raise taxes on Americans, particularly at the 22% level. So there may be a point where desperation kicks in, and just to get the 2017 bill extended the way that it was, folks may have to come together and say, okay, we're just going to do a clean extension to ensure that the tax framework everyone is operating under today continues for some period of time. And that brings me to the Farm Bill conversation in the Ag committees. So in addition to some new leadership at the House and Senate more broadly, we've got some new leadership at the Ag committees. We have new ranking members, both in the Senate and the House, both from Minnesota, both really ag savvy women. Amy Klobuchar, Senator Amy Klobuchar from Minnesota, and ranking member Angie Craig, also from Minnesota. These women have deep ties to the agriculture community. They have been very engaged in the committee space over the years. They also have incredible bipartisan records. These are two women that are very willing and very apt at reaching across the aisle and building consensus and building relationships with their Republican counterparts. And I would say there's nothing more important in this Washington than having really good, respectful relationships, because sometimes, depending on the tenor of Congress, they're few and far between. Chairman Bozeman and Chairman Thompson, also two people deeply connected to agriculture, deep understanding of the policies that are included in the Farm Bill and the agriculture space in general. I would bet every day on Chairman Thompson's integrity and his want to get a Farm Bill done. I just don't know if his conference, if the Republican conference will allow that to occur. But I know he is working diligently, and the same with Chairman Bozeman. And thus far, the four of them, wherever possible, have really presented a united bipartisan front on the Farm Bill. Sort of one of the beacons of hope in the legislative space is that agriculture is still continuing to have at least some semblance of bipartisanship within its leadership. But that doesn't mean that the Farm Bill is not still an incredibly uphill battle. The current bill expires September 30th. If they don't get it done by September 30th, they've got some flexibility. USDA can pull some strings to make programs last a little bit longer. But it's gonna be really hard. I thought we might have lightning strike at the end of last year and get a Farm Bill, but you've got a lot of really deep policy disagreements, which are not going to be alleviated. They will just be deepened, I think, by the reconciliation conversation. And you've got a lot of education gaps. You've got more than 50% of House members who've never voted on a Farm Bill. So farm credit is, we continue to be committed to supporting our customers and get the things in the Farm Bill that our customers need, as well as helping get a strong Farm Bill passed with a strong safety net. And really, the timing to not have a Farm Bill could not be worse. You've got some real stress points in the agriculture economy. Right now, even though you have some brighter spots in the livestock space, you've got some real stress in cotton and hogs and beans and corn, in particularly in some parts of the country that are much more stressed. Of the Southeast, some of the mature tree folks out west have a lot of stress going on, and that's not even talking about folks that have been through the recent natural disasters. Last year, at the end of last year, one of the reasons why we were able to advocate so efficiently and effectively for additional ag, economic, and disaster assistance was because this $80 billion fall off in net farm income in 2023, and then it was exacerbated in 2024, was becoming very obvious to members of Congress. And you can see in this chart as well, farm income was consistently starting to come down at a fairly significant clip. Now, because of the funding that went out at the end of last year, USDA is now estimating a big chunk again of federal dollars going into agriculture, and that might help cash flow producers through this, at least this next year. Now, what's to be seen is if we are in the same sort of trade situation that we were in back in 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019, when again, the federal government had to push out a lot of support to agriculture, is Congress willing to provide that additional financial support on top of the financial support that's already come out? Now, in 2020, they were willing to do so. With the immense need to bring down the national debt and to work through the spending levels that we are currently operating on, and the messages coming out of the administration to cut government spending, I think it's going to be a real hard process for agriculture to get any additional funding if it's necessary. However, the administration has signaled that if our trade wars continue and they continue to ramp up tariffs, that they are willing to support agriculture depending on what the damage may look like, if they even determine that there has been damage. The last thing on the Farm Bill I'll leave you with is Farm Credit is looking for ways that we can do a little bit more for rural communities. So we've got some legislation pending that would help us do more to help to finance and support those industries around fishing. So we can already finance folks that are directly fishing the waters or in aquaculture, but we would like to also help those businesses that support those fishing operations, so the ice folks, etc. We also would like to see an increase in both the direct and the guaranteed loan limits for operating and mortgage loans through USDA. And then we also are very interested in helping with the financing of the building of rural community facilities, so critical access hospitals, skilled nursing facilities, senior care facilities, and childcare in particular, figuring out ways that Farm Credit can be a partner with nonprofits to help bring those facilities or to upgrade those facilities in very rural communities. And then finally, I would be remiss if I did not highlight our national contributions program. Farm Credit has, over the past 15 years at the national level, so at the Farm Credit Council level, we have a robust giving program, and we're so proud of our partners, specifically ones like Annie's Project. Can't tell you how many times I go around speaking to farm credit groups or speaking to other stakeholder groups like yours, and it is not uncommon for folks to say Farm Credit is often the only lender in the room, and we're very proud of that. We want to go places that other lenders won't go. So we're really proud of our partnerships with Annie's Project and FFA and 4-H and Farmers Union and Farm Bureau and so many other amazing agriculture organizations across the country. And that's completely separate even from what individual farm credit institutions are doing. They all have their own partnerships with organizations like Annie's Project, FFA, 4-H, other types of sustainability programs, heirs property programs. I mean, you name it, if it's in agriculture, we're probably in some way involved in it and partnered on those initiatives. So we could not be more proud of our partnerships, and we are so grateful to have our partnership with Annie's Project and to be invited to speak to groups like yours and understand, hopefully help you understand a little bit more about the opportunities that Farm Credit can offer, but more importantly, have you all, as some of you I'm sure are Farm Credit customers, members of the ag community, tell us what message we can bring back to Washington on your behalf. So with that, I'll stop sharing, and I will thank you so much for having me, and I'm happy to answer whatever questions you may have.
Well, we have, fortunately for you, lots of questions.
Fantastic.
So one of the questions that came in very early on is, well, we have several questions that have come in, but somebody was asking about the FDA suspending milk quality testing and wanted you to address that announcement that has come up and kind of what that looks like and what that impact might be.
Well, unfortunately, I'm not a dairy expert by any means. I can tell you what I do know about dairy is that it's one of the most complicated programs in the Farm Bill. And I can also tell you that the level of interaction that I think ag is going to need to have with the Food and Drug Administration and the HHS agency in general is going to be a bigger education effort than what we have had to do before. So I don't know anything specific about milk testing. I imagine that's maybe something to do with the raw milk space, but again, it's a little bit outside of my expertise.
Okay. Well, they've made some cuts because of workforce cuts, and so there's a lot of concern in the dairy industry with those cuts.
And I encourage you, if this is impacting you individually, reach out to your member of Congress. If you go to house.gov and type in your zip code, it'll tell you who your member of Congress is and your senator. It's at the top of the page. They need to know what's happening and the impacts of it. And I will say, I know there are a lot of members of Congress who are very diligently having quiet conversations with the administration at all levels. And many of them are getting responses when that education is occurring. So your voice in this education process as an individual producer has never been more important.
Thank you.
Jenny, we had a couple of questions regarding tariffs and just talking about how disruptive they are going to have been to agriculture. And I'm just going to kind of ask you, kind of combine two of the questions of how long do you think the tariff trade war is going to kind of be in existence? How long do you think the back and forth is going to last? And then second part to that question is how can farmers navigate these challenges? If you have any suggestions for that.
Yes, yes. I know the level of uncertainty is immense. We're dealing with it as well. And I don't think anybody outside of a very small handful of folks in the White House have a good sense of what the plan is, and that includes members of Congress. I think as the administration saw, particularly the bond market suffer and that stressor on what and the impacts that stressor would have on not just the American economy, but the international economy was enough to have them back off. They obviously doubled down on China, which I know has a lot of implications for some of the inputs that agriculture utilizes, as well as our ability to re-access those markets, those export markets. I believe the ultimate goal here is to make the environment in general more fair. So pushing our trade partners to live up to, in some cases, the deals that we already have with them. Now, I'm not a tariff expert. I don't know if tariffs is the perfect solution to pushing that conversation. But again, I think the most important thing agriculture can do is to communicate and to educate and to help folks understand you're paying attention and that there may be implications for trade decisions that folks maybe hadn't thought through. And if they are thinking them through, understanding that they need to know the level of pain. Like I know the president has said in some instances, we've got to have to work through a little bit of pain to get something at the end. Well, they have to understand what a little bit of pain versus a lot of pain is. So how, if agriculture can communicate and explain, these are some of the nuances of our industry and our market access comparatively to other industries, I think that that's really important.
So somebody wrote in a follow-up, and I think we'll ask this. With today's presidential announcement about reducing tariffs with China, are we to possibly feel hopeful?
Potentially. I think if the administration is starting to see some give in their conversations, or if they believe that the damage to the economy is too great, they have certainly demonstrated the ability and the willingness to change course, right? I mean, we've seen that happen now multiple times where they've talked about tariffs and delayed them or implemented them and then rescinded them. Some of this conversation may also drive Congress to take back some of Congress's ownership of the tariff process, which Congress for many years had a very engaged way of dealing with trade agreements and trade and tariff conversations, and really over the past several years have taken a step back from engaging with their power in that space. But from Reagan, Clinton, when you saw a lot of these free trade agreements move forward, Congress was deeply involved in those negotiations. They were less so during the Trump administration, during USMCA, and then the Biden administration did not negotiate or discuss any trade agreements.
Another question that came in today: what do you suggest for those of us who have lost funding through canceled programs that were originally told were obligated funds? We have contacted our members of Congress many times with no responses. Any other tips?
If you are sending emails, call the offices. If you can get to a staff member, get to a staff member. So try to ask for the person responsible for agriculture issues in the office, or go on down to their district office, or their, senators have many state offices, and with your issue, your application, all of the documentation that you have, and explain to them what's going on. I think for the most part, the administration has demonstrated if the funding was supposed to go to an individual producer or was mostly going to an individual producer, they want to honor those contracts. So communicating early and often, and you want to be respectful, right, when you're communicating, but you can be consistent as well to ensure that what I would describe as a constituent services issue. So you are a constituent of that member of Congress and that senator, and being a little bit of a squeaky wheel in the constituent services space is not a terrible thing.
Yep. So thank you for that. That's, I think, been my experience being the squeaky wheel. You need to be that. You need to advocate for yourself. So we had another question. Do you expect to see the closure of USDA, FSA, and NRCS offices?
That's a really interesting one. There has been incredible congressional pushback to many administrations when they have suggested consolidating or closing FSA, NRCS, RUS, etc. offices. Part of that is because of the fact that USDA is still operating on this very antiquated technology system. So often it is easier and faster in this day and age even for a producer to fill out a form and then take it down to their local FSA office and drop it off. Because if you try to do it on the internet, you have to sign up for accounts and they take you to 5 different sites, and it can become a real mess real fast. You also have to turn in a lot of survey data, etc., into your actual office. Now, if USDA is able to solve some of those technology program problems and services are more provided through their websites and their other platforms, I could see that happening. And they may try to reduce force, but until I think members of Congress are comfortable with the fact that those agencies can deliver the services they've already had to deliver, particularly as the year goes on and we go into renewal season and harvest, etc. Like we're in planting now, but once we go into harvest, and if you have crop insurance losses and people can't get to RMA in a timely fashion, as the tenor rises amongst the producer community, you'll have more people pay attention, and they'll have to make a real decision of, can USDA truly deliver the services without the people in place on the ground at this juncture?
Thank you.
Next question, Jenny. What percentage of ag loans are at risk of being in default, i.e. 2025 versus 2020? And are bankruptcies on the rise?
2025 versus 2020. So I don't know so the snapshot that I can provide is very specific to farm credit. So that's obviously not the entirety of the agriculture credit space. Traditional community banks have a large portion of that, as do some other types of lenders. We are not seeing a huge uptick in the farm credit portfolio in foreclosures or what we call non-accruals. So loans that are in some form or fashion potentially in trouble. Some of that is because Farm Credit, as a mission-driven organization, as an organization that has really built ourselves with the capital to deal with an ag economic downturn, because that's our job. Farm Credit is here to stay in the marketplace. We will not leave the marketplace. We can't pull out and say, you know what, there's this other industry we'd much rather invest in. That's not Farm Credit's mission. That's not our role. Our role is to be in agriculture in good times and bad. So, I have heard some anecdotes that other parts of the credit industry are pulling out and seeking other places to extend credit. Farm Credit isn't seeing that as much currently. That's not to say that there is not a lot of pain at the individual level in a lot of communities that is not represented in the aggregate Farm Credit numbers. And that's not to say that, we are not really trying to help folks work through difficult decisions at individual operations. That's absolutely occurring, and we are very sympathetic to that. We want to work with our customers as much as we can through that process without over leveraging that customer in the long run, right? There's a balance that you strike there. But farm credit specifically, we're seeing a very, very small uptick, nothing compared to years of real economic strife despite the environment. Now, how sustainable that is to be seen. And when, like you said, you have the lack of certainty because of a lack of a farm bill, you have lack of certainty because of trade conditions, you have a lack of certainty because of input costs. As all of these lack of certainties pile on, we understand that that puts a lot of stress on our farmer community. And Farm Credit has also invested deeply in farmer mental health. So we have a training program for our loan officers to detect stress and to work with customers in that space. We have farm credit institutions that have just put out that are getting ready to roll out a documentary in May for Mental Health Month that really shines some light on farm mental health and suicide rates in farm country. That documentary is called Out of the Shadows, and it will be again available on all of our farm credit sites starting in May. And we're really committed to making sure that rural communities know that we're a resource in that space, that we're a good partner in the mental health space, but then also bringing it to light for members of Congress so that they know as this uncertainty continues, the mental strain for our producers is real and prevalent, and we want them to be aware and pay attention as well.
Okay, well, we're continuing to get questions in here. Do you expect a historical underserved classification that has served diverse small and veteran farmers well to be eliminated from programs within USDA?
I don't know. The underserved producer and socially disadvantaged producer and veteran call-outs are legislatively, so they're congressionally dictated. Congress, because they were included in Farm Bill languages, USDA in theory has to implement those programs as directed by Congress. They have some flexibility, but those definitions are defined again in statute. So there's not a ton of flexibility there. So if USDA were to decide to say, to eliminate the veteran preference in a program where Congress has already added into statute what the definition of a veteran is and where their preference would apply, then I would expect organizations to litigate that.
Okay.
So it might be, some of those things might be part of this more drawn out court battle process. But I think it says a lot. For some of those definitions, I think it says a lot that USDA has not highlighted them thus far. I think they understand. I know there are folks down there, really smart folks that we've worked with for years, who wrote some of these farm bills in the past.
Next question. What can Farm Credit do to help small farmers continue with all of the challenges that we are facing?
I love that question. So as part of the Farm Credit mission, we have a specific part of our mission to support young, beginning, and small producers. So we have, depending on, if you meet the definition of small, which is $350,000 or less of gross income, then we have special programs designed for you as a producer. Some of them are preferential lending treatment or reduced interest rates. Many of them come with education components as well. So if you complete some financial education through Farm Credit that we would provide, et cetera, that you are eligible for these programs. Every Farm Credit institution has their own young, beginning, and small program. They consist of all different kinds of tools. So I encourage you, if you are young, beginning, or small, and you're looking for additional resources, or even many of our institutions offer free educational opportunities for folks in agriculture as well. So reach out to your Farm Credit Institution. You can find your Farm Credit Institution on farmcredit.com. There's a button that says Find Your Lender. And if you go there, you can explore their Young Beginning and Small programming. You can also go into an office and ask about their Young Beginning or Small program, or give them a call. All of them have loan officers and other experts that really understand the programs that they offer, and they're really proud to offer those programs.
Thank you. We also had a question. I also want to echo the comments that in my lived experience, contacting members of Congress regarding canceled programming is absolutely ineffective. Members of Congress are not responding to concerns regarding ag programs.
I know it's frustrating. I do. Communication is your best tool and option, right? It's the tool that Farm Credit is utilizing. When we're seeing an issue, we're letting the administration know, we're letting members of Congress know. If you are part of other member organizations besides any, like soybeans or corn or Farm Bureau, National Farmers Unions, let them know what's happening on your operation. Maybe they can help make those connections. Reach out to your local Farm Credit Institution if there's some connections that we can help make as well. But again, I know how frustrating it is. Again, the more you communicate, the more channels you utilize to communicate, the better. And understand too, members of Congress, their staff are trying to navigate these agencies as well. And everybody's calling in with different concerns. I would imagine the concerns are heightened right now as well. So the volume of calls is probably increased, and it just takes them time. I can tell you this because I've been on that side of the desk. I have worked for members of Congress. I have done constituent services. It was the most incredible, rewarding part of my job. The members of Congress that I worked for were really committed to their constituent services, and you get calls about all kinds of things, and you do your best to navigate those federal agencies to achieve something regardless of which party they're in. So I encourage you to keep trying. It's sometimes just about getting to the right person, but I absolutely empathize with how frustrating it is.
We have, about another gazillion questions that came in. We do have a few more that are coming in live. We had some come in with registrations. Why don't you go ahead with the next one, Carisha?
Sure. I'm going to switch to, sorry, I'm looking at the spreadsheet here. I'm going to go back and look at one of the questions that came in with registration. Will we be able to enroll in an extension or renewal of FSA programs, pollinator programs, et cetera, when the contract ends in 2025 or 2026? And do you know if there are changes to the EQIP programs this year?
I do not. Those are all I'm familiar with those programs in general. I have not seen any announcements that they're making changes to the changes that I'm most familiar with currently are the Climate Smart Commodities programs changes, and all of those folks are being asked to reapply. So I don't know if they will ask for new criteria or new information from you as you reapply for these things. But to my knowledge, I haven't seen anything about certainly specifically not renewing individual producer contracts. But again, that's beyond my expertise level.
So we had a number of questions related to where is good, reliable, not opinion-based information that people can, watch for, track, so they can keep track of what's going on in DC. Several people alluded to the fact that, since things are so opinion-based or politically charged and things like that, where do you get the facts so you can follow what's happening with agriculture in DC?
Absolutely. A couple things. I'm a big proponent of reading your news. I don't want to be yelled at by my news broadcaster, and I'm sure all of you are tired of that same sort of tenor. So I am, when it comes to big national news, the big newspapers, I love to read. I think then you can create your own, you can elicit your own tone and make some decisions in your head if it's not just coming at you with someone else's voice. So I'm a big Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, New York Times, Financial Times person. I work in the lending industry as well, so that financial services piece is important to me. And then from an agriculture news perspective, I really like AgriPulse, which is sort of an inside the Beltway news newsletter that gets put out. I think she posts a certain amount of things. The editor there posts a certain amount of things for free every day, but you can also pay to get that newsletter. Her and her team are great. This is what's happening. This is what we've heard. Members of Congress trust her, so you get a lot of candid information through AgriPulse. What else do I really like? I think the Politico, I know there's been some mixed conversations about Politico, but Politico Pro has an ag newsletter that also tends to be very fact-based, less opinion, less spin, so you can get a good sense of what's happening. And then, Farm Credit, most farm credit institutions offer for free a ton of economic data resources for your operations, as well as analysis of different things that are coming out of the administration, for instance, trade impacts, et cetera. So I encourage you, Farm Credit's got an organization that many farm credits are involved in called Terrain. They put out an enormous amount of economic data. Farm Credit Services of America, they have an entire ag reporting economic data section of their website, as well as AgWest. So agwest.com has they've got a dairy expert. And what they'll do is they'll take some of the things coming out of the administration, new rules, they'll include some economic data and then help folks understand how to navigate that. They do crop insurance sign up, free webinar navigations. There's a ton of free resources through Farm Credit. We can get you maybe some of those that you can post them when you send out the recording of the webinar.
Sounds great.
Okay.
One last question for you, Jenny. With the Farm Bill reauthorization process underway, what are Farm Credit Council's top priorities for ensuring access to affordable credit and risk management tools for farmers and ranchers?
Absolutely. So our number one goal at Farm Credit is to work with our agriculture partners to get a strong farm bill done. So that is increasing the farm safety net in the crop insurance space, as well as in the specialty crop insurance space. That's a huge priority. We want to make sure we've got strong commodity programs that are in place. We want to ensure that the investments that have been made in things like CRP that many of our producers take advantage of continue to be included, EQIP. We're also huge proponents, like I said, of ensuring that FSA loan guarantee and direct lending programs are available for producers. They're an incredibly important tool for Farm Credit so that we can get in early with young, beginning and small producers, get them started with a loan guarantee, and then help them transition to traditional credit products over the next several years. So we love, the ability to use loan guarantees. We're looking for some changes in the loan guarantee process to make it a little bit easier for Farm Credit to work with customers a little bit faster so that folks aren't missing opportunities at, for instance, land auctions because they're waiting on USDA to do some paperwork. And as we all know, land prices have increased, cost of production has increased. So we want to make sure the caps for those loan levels that USDA currently has are high enough to accommodate your specialty crop operations, your new business models in particular that young beginning producers are looking to get into. And then finally, like I said, Farm Credit is really working to get a little bit more authority to help to partner in rural communities to ensure that rural vitality, rural infrastructure piece continues to be accessible, because we know to have farmers, you have to have strong farm communities where your producers and their families can access healthcare and childcare and senior care. So how can Farm Credit engage in those spaces? Is just do a little bit more and partner with community facilities to ensure that those facilities are either upgraded and up to code, or those facilities are built in populations of 25,000 or less. So we're really proud of that legislation that we're working on.
Well, we could spend the rest of the afternoon with all of the different questions, and I guess this is just a signal, Jenny, that we need to have another one of these conversations. But we do appreciate you being with us today and kind of leading us through some of the weeds and helping us understand a little bit more about what's going on federally with our legislation and the policies and executive orders and so on. So we really appreciate all of that knowledge and experience that you've brought to us. And thank you to everyone who has participated in today's session. If you liked this, please let us know. There will be a survey post session, and we'd be happy to have future sessions based on your input. So thank you again, Jenny, and thank you everyone for being a part of our panel today. Any last words? I'll let you have the last words, Jenny.
I would just say thank you so much for having me, and it is the honor of my life to get to represent Farm Credit and our customers, and there's nobody I would rather be speaking to than producers out in the field. So this is a real special thing for me to get to do, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you again.